Hi, boys and girls. We are welcome to our history lesson. I know you've been talking about and learning a little bit about the Civil War with Mr. Guerrero. We might be reviewing a few of those things because I wasn't sure how much you had talked about, but it's been a while, so it never hurts to review. So today we're going to hear a story about a little girl who is named Minty. Um, and she grows up to be a woman called Harriet Tubman. So I didn't know her childhood name. I'd only heard of Harriet Tubman, but so in the story, when you hear about a girl named Minty, um, she grows up to become a woman called Harriet Tubman. All right, so we'll remember that. All right, and we'll get into our story. Minty's eyelids were heavy. Her head bobbled up and down as she faded in and out of sleep. She pinched herself to try to stay awake, but the house was so quiet and calm. Even the tree frogs, crickets, and other creatures of the night had stopped chirping and croaking. It seemed all of Maryland was asleep at this late hour, except young Minty. At age 6, Minty should have been asleep too. Her body and mind cried out for sleep, yet she dared not doze off for fear she would not hear the baby crying. This baby was Minty's responsibility. She watched over the baby day and night, rocked him to sleep, kept him warm in his blanket, and sang songs to keep him happy. Minty would do anything in her power to keep him happy, for she knew that if he cried, she would be punished. And so, each time the baby stirred in his crib, each time he whimpered or moaned, Minty's heart raced. As soon as the baby cried out, even if he only cried for a moment, the baby's mother would get very angry with Minty. This was the painful reality in which Minty lived, because Minty was an enslaved African person. Even at the age of 6 years old, she was forced to work for no pay all day long, every day. And Minty thought she would be enslaved her entire life until she died. This was the terrible truth of slavery. Minty and other enslaved Africans like her had no rights or freedom. Minty would be forced to do the hard work given to her from sunup to sundown, providing great value to the plantation owner almost every day of her entire life. Very, very little of Minty's time would ever be her own to do with as she wished. This is what life was like for millions of people in the United States of America when Minty was 6. In fact, this is what life had been like for many people for a long time, long before Minty or her parents and grandparents were born. One night, Minty asked her mother how and why she and her family had become enslaved. "Well, your grandmother," her mother told her, "she came over the ocean on a great big ship. She came from a place called Africa. Many Africans are here now, enslaved in this land they call the United States." "Why did grandmother and other Africans come here?" Minty asked. "It was not their choice to come here from Africa," her mother explained. "Africans were captured by men with guns and other weapons who wanted to bring them to America to work in slavery. They were put on these ships against their will, and then they were brought to this country and sent to places like plantations, farms, businesses, or households to work. That's why our life is the way it is. We do as we are told, and we do our best to survive." By this, Minty's mother meant they worked hard to keep their families as safe and healthy as possible. Minty's father and mother had 9 children, including Minty. But like most enslaved Africans, the family did not live or work together all in one home. Minty's mother worked for a man named Edward Broadus. Minty's father worked for a man named Edward Thompson, whose plantation was down the road from the Broadus home. 3 of Minty's sisters were sent away to work for plantation owners in Georgia. Minty never saw any of them again. As her mother said, enslaved people did not have a choice or say in the matter. The plantation owners did whatever they had to do to make as much money as possible from their plantations and slave labor. Because families of enslaved Africans often could not live together or were separated, they depended on the community of the enslaved Africans on the plantation. Mothers and fathers would take care of children who were not their own. Enslaved Africans helped and supported each other as communities by looking out for each other and working together. In this way, they could be strong together, despite the fact that they were enslaved. Although life was hard for the enslaved people, this working together and helping each other contributed to their survival and made it better. Where Minty lived, the enslaved Africans worked hard to perform many jobs that added value to the plantation. They took care of the horses and tended crops of tobacco, corn, and hay, plowing, planting, and harvesting. In the winter, they chopped wood, mended fences, and helped clear more land for farming. Many enslaved people were skilled at a trade. Some tended to the farm animals, and butchers preserved the meat. Weavers, spinners, and seamstresses were involved in the process of making clothing. Their skills were valued. Skilled carpenters constructed and repaired buildings and made furniture, and blacksmiths used iron to make and mend important tools for the life and work of the plantation. Many lived in shacks with dirt floors, had one set of tattered clothing and no shoes, and didn't have enough to eat. Most enslaved Africans worked out in the fields, performing the many difficult tasks involved in growing and harvesting the crops. They were known as field slaves, and they lived the hardest lives of all. They worked from early morning until late at night, often with no relief from the heat or rest from their hard labor. They always worked under the watchful eye of the overseers, people who kept watch over and directed the enslaved people. The enslaved people always worked under the threat of punishment. Other enslaved Africans worked in what was known as the Big House, the beautiful mansion belonging to the plantation owners. They did not have to work in the hot sun. They wore nicer clothes than the field slaves, and they sometimes had more food. In addition to daily cooking and cleaning, house slaves helped make butter, wash the laundry, and care for the plantation owner's young children. That was Minty's job, which was why she was watching the baby at night. Just like those who worked in the fields, enslaved Africans who worked in the house worked hard. But also like the people who worked in the fields, they helped each other a lot, and this made it less hard and less sad. Plantations, like the one where Minty and other enslaved Africans lived and worked, were common throughout Maryland and all of the states in the southern United States, or the South. The South had rich soil and lots of farmland. Those who owned the land could get rich by growing and selling tobacco, cotton, and other crops. Running a large plantation required many workers. There were no tractors or other machines to help in those days. The enslaved Africans who worked on a plantation contributed valuable skills and labor to the success of the plantation. Without the enslaved Africans, the plantation could not be run. They did many important jobs of all kinds. Even so, rather than hiring workers and paying them, plantation owners who were white forced people who were black to work for free in a life of slavery. The plantation owners thought they could treat these African people this way because they looked different. Because of this difference in the way they looked, the plantation owners thought they were better than the people they enslaved. As enslaved people, they were not given any wages for the work they did on the plantations. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to live a life of slavery. and the children of the enslaved Africans, children like Minty and her brothers and sisters, automatically became enslaved the very moment they were born. They would likely remain enslaved until they died. As Minty's mother explained, enslaved people did not have the choice to be free people. Or did they? Early on, Minty began to wonder whether it was possible to resist, to fight back as an enslaved person. She wondered this because she had, in fact, seen her own mother resist the plantation owner's wishes. When Minty was young, Mr. Broadus arranged to send her brother Moses to a plantation belonging to another owner. Minty's mother had already seen 3 of her daughters sent far away to another plantation down south, and she was determined not to lose any more of her children. When Mr. Broadus came to fetch Moses to send him away with the other plantation owner, Minty's mother stood in the doorway and promised, "I will not allow any more of my children to be taken away." Something in her eyes must have scared Mr. Broadus that day, because he turned around and he never tried to send Moses or anyone else in Minty's family away again. This event gave Minty a shred of hope that one day she might be able to fight back and possibly win her freedom. That is the beginning of our story about Harriet Tubman. We'll learn more about her later life in our next lesson. Let's see. So my first question, actually, let's see. You can go ahead and get the sheet out from your bag that says Part 1 Story Recall, and we'll just use that to review some of the things we learned in our lesson today. All right. So you can pause the video if you need to so you can get this. All right, our first question was, what was Harriet Tubman's childhood nickname? Who remembers? Good. It was Minty. So we'll write that on this line. And remember, if it's someone's name or even a nickname, we always start it with a capital letter because it is a proper noun. All right, so this is how we write her name. And remember, start with a capital letter. All right, question 2 says, at the age of 6, what was Harriet's job? Was she plowing fields? Was she caring for a baby? Or was she doing laundry? That's right, she was caring for a baby. So you can just go ahead and fill in that bubble next to B, caring for a baby. All right. Now, number 3, we might have to go back and review in the story again. It says, name 2 jobs enslaved Africans performed in the field. 2 jobs that they performed in the field. Okay, let's see. Well, so when it was time to be planting crops, they would do that. And they took care of the horses, and then they took care of the crops, and they harvested. Okay, let's see. So there's several things that we could put. Let's see, let's say harvesting crops and caring for animals. So harvesting crops, and I'll write it down so you can get everything spelled correctly. We're going to put this page into a book. We're making a book about Harriet Tubman, so I know we're going to want to have everything spelled nicely. So I put harvesting crops on the first line, and then let's see, put caring for animals. It mentions that there were some skilled slaves who were skilled. They would spin and sew. They were butchers. Um, but these were probably some of the more common ones. So harvesting crops and caring for animals. If you need to pause the video so you get things spelled correctly, feel free. All right. Number 4 says name 2 jobs that enslaved Africans performed in the big house. So remember on the plantation, that was where the owners of the plantation lived. And so the slaves who didn't work in the fields, um, a lot of them would work in the house. And were their lives a little bit easier if the slaves who worked in the big house? Right, they were a little bit easier. Well, they still had to work really hard, but sometimes they got nicer food and more clothes. Let's see, well, we know that some of the enslaved people who worked in the house watched the babies. Let's see, they also did laundry. Let's see, so let's say wash laundry. And then they would also, let's say they would cook all the meals. Wash laundry and cook meals. We could also put, you know, care for children, make butter. But I just picked these 2 because we kind of remember just from hearing about Minty that the slaves who worked in the house would care for the children. All right, and then our last question on this page said, when Harriet's mom stood up to the overseer taking her brother Moses, Harriet felt, did she feel A, hopeful to fight for freedom? Did she feel B, afraid of punishment? Or C, mad at her mom? So at the end of the story, we heard about her mom standing up to the overseer who was trying to take her brother Moses away, Minty's brother Moses. And how did Harriet feel? Was she hopeful to fight for freedom? Was she afraid of punishment? Or was she mad at her mom? That's right. It said, A, it made her feel hopeful. Like maybe sometimes, since her mom was able to stand up to the overseers, then maybe someday Harriet would be able to do that too. All right, so you can put this sheet back in your book back in your bag for right now. We'll finish up with Harriet Tubman in our next lesson, and then we'll make the rest of this book. But this is all for today. I'll see you next time. Bye.